Hello everyone and welcome.
Hello everyone. Welcome to episode 3 of the
Graduating podcast.
graduating podcast that we're doing for our graduating project.
That's right, we finally came up with a name. I know, it was very, very difficult. We spent a long time on that one.
Going once, going twice, won't these gentlemen suffice? Any here, any there, any motions anywhere. Going twice, going thrice.
We're going to the early 2000s to start off today, because I want to talk about Web 2.0. If you guys don't know what this is the rise of user-generated content on the internet. So things like being able to respond to whatever content you're looking at on the internet, whether it's an article or a news piece. You could leave your own comments or even upload your own videos to websites. And this was huge at the time. It allowed for two-way internet highways, two ways of information on the internet highways. So it's not just, web developers or news companies making content. It was users as well, which is just amazing at the time. So the term Web 2.0 was coined by Danny DiNucci in 1999. I hope I got that name right. And it was popularized by Tim O'Reilly in 2004. With the turn of Web 2.0, that allowed for a lot of, a lot of transferring of, what we already see in the real world coming to the internet, or having its own equivalent at least. So things like jokes, comedy, entertainment, of course, the news. And along with that came activism as well. And so it inspired people to make their own organizations, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. So the first one I'd like to bring up is the Youth Justice Coalition, founded by Kim McGill and 60 other people in 2003. Now this organization is based in Los Angeles, California, and it was centered on assisting former prisoners in telling their stories of injustice and unruly incarcerations. So the fact that there was 60 people that came together to begin with to tell these sorts of stories and say, I've been unfairly imprisoned is pretty big on its own. And the fact that they all came together and agreed to work on something as, a digital project of this caliber is just crazy to think about at the time. So the success of the Youth Justice Coalition sort of inspired similar groups and the allies of the YJC to start their own movements as well and start their own organizations. And the first one I want to bring up is Fierce. Now, Fierce is a Manhattan-based organization, and they created the Fenced Out documentary in order to highlight some of the feelings of loss that the LGBTQ youth of the West Village area in New York City experienced when they were forced away from the Christopher Street Pier, which was a popular meeting point for these youths. So a lot of the ways that the Youth Justice Coalition especially tried to, spread its stories of its, former prisoner members was through video stories. It doesn't explicitly say exactly what these videos were sort of formatted on, but it's interesting they use the word stories because we see that word a lot within social media nowadays. You see that on Snapchat and Instagram, especially. Both those things have stories. It's interesting how there's a sort of equivalent or a link between the two. But they're obviously different. The video stories of back then in 2003 were more like 6 to 7 minute YouTube videos. Or not YouTube videos, because YouTube didn't exist back then, my apologies. Just, 6 to 7 minute long videos. I imagine they'd be either sent through email or videotapes, because that was huge back then. The world sort of, the digital world sort of existed in email or on videotapes, because that was basically the easiest way to send a video to anybody. You put it on a videotape and you mail it, People used mail back then. It was amazing. And of course, email was an alternative as well. I remember seeing tons and tons of email chains between hundreds of strangers. Those were the sort of chat rooms of the ancient era of the internet. Back then, you either had to wait for the news to say something about it or wait for it to show up in the newspaper. And I suppose today's equivalent of that is, hearing about it on Facebook, which of course there's disadvantages to that. There's people who make fictitious articles or spread rumors for the sake of, baiting people or trolling people. But of course, we'll get into those later in a later episode. Let's keep focusing on the sort of ancient digital activism just for the minute here. I do find it quite a spectacle that some organizations like Fierce and like the Youth Justice Coalition can come together and make this sort of multimedia content in order to express whatever messages they can. And it allowed for, at least in the Youth Justice Coalition case, for them to sort of show that prisoners can have their own voices and they don't need professional advocates or lawyers to speak over them. And they took these sort of video stories that they made and the written reports that they made to directly to law enforcement to sort of educate them and say, hey, listen, these are people, you know, they feel like they're not getting a good hand dealt to them, and it's something you need to pay more attention to and consider in your police training. And I want to talk about police training maybe in another episode because I think it's a really interesting topic and it does relate to some of the things we will talk about in later episodes. But don't mind me bagging on about later episodes. You guys will see that when it comes out. Um, and then I want to come back to Fierce as well because I think it was founded by about 11 people, which I guess is a more reasonable number than 60, as we saw with the YJC before, because it's like I don't think anyone really has 60 friends. That's a lot of people. So I think that really helped to get the YJC off the ground because that's a lot of support, 60 people, back then and now especially, since we're all so distant with the pandemic and whatnot. Um, so the 11 people that founded Fierce, one of them was Crystal Portalaton. Sorry if I butchered that name. She was one of the co-founders, and she made a point to say that there's the desire to use more multimedia strategy to, you know, tell stories and make a point and make awareness of things, but not to fund it. And that's a big problem, funding. You really needed a lot of money to, even now, you need a lot of money to get anything off the ground, any project. If it's not funded by a major institution or organization or just any sort of governing body, you're going to obviously struggle to get anywhere. And so that's why a lot of these organizations stayed underground. That's why we don't know a lot about them, because they didn't hit the limelight. They just didn't have the money or resources behind them. Um, even in saying that, like the YJC is still around and active today. It's actually aged surprisingly well. I even looked at their website last night, and I'll leave a link to their website somewhere on screen for our YouTube viewers if you want to check that out. It's surprisingly modern and it's easy to navigate. No, it's amazing. It's stuck around this long. It must have really gotten the legs to keep going. I'm just I'm blown away. You know, congratulations to them. Um, it's clear from that alone that they've definitely made an impact, and helped these former prisoners really, you know, uh, become activists. You know, that's the most important part about this. So I do
How do you
want.
Oh,
Sorry.
if I could just ask a question, how do you think these like early forms of like activist groups, how do you see them influencing digital activist groups today, and how do you think their sort of formula has stuck around?
I think the way they sort of inspire and influence digitally active groups today is the fact that, you know, just their existence alone is a lot to say. Because if that sort of thing can be done back then, before social media existed, before things like change.org existed, back when Google was like still quite archaic, it sort of brings a consideration to mind that anyone can do it. You know,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter what kind of resources you have in front of you as long as you make the best of them. Because of course back then, having like a high quality camera, video editing software, recording software, or just a computer in general was, you know, it was a fairly uncommon thing. So I think we really shouldn't take for granted nowadays the opportunities we have to sit here and do something like a podcast. You know, like that's a pretty amazing opportunity.
I think that's what a lot of people see as being the value in digital activism. I think it's for its ability to really have a grassroots appeal and just start from the ground up, like you know, like just on like a messaging board or on like Facebook or on Twitter. It can really start from there, and its ability to spread and reach a much wider audience than it would in with less effort and less, you know, active work
Mm.
than traditional activist methods. I think that's really the value that people see in it.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely a very sort of intimate and personal nature to it because you're not sitting there and having some authority figure telling you what to say or what to study. You're doing your own project, your own thing, and you're doing it in exactly the way you want to do it. It is difficult, and of course, oh well, I don't agree on the premise that it's, you know, it's easy to do. I think the access to do it is, you know, very available. It is easy to get into. It's just hard to make it keep going.
Oh, I definitely don't think that it's easy, like per
Right.
se, but I think it's much more accessible than traditional activist methods. You know, like when you compare actually going out and demonstrating, that requires a lot more like physical effort. You could argue that like activism online is more. There's more effort in other areas. Like you might have to edit things, you might have to like put videos together and put work into those sorts of areas into like communicating messages and spreading it.
Yeah.
But I think when compared to traditional activist methods, it's much more accessible for the average person.
Yeah, I think if you want to become a traditional in-person activist, there's a lot of education I feel like you'd need. It's a very arduous sounding role to play. Whereas if you want to participate in digital acts, all you need is like some sort of device that can connect to the internet, if whether it's a phone or a laptop, a tablet, whatever, and of course an internet connection. That's it. You don't need anything else but that's the bare minimum. But to become an actual real life activist, you need to have experience in communicating, having conducting interviews, event management, project management. The list goes on. You need education for this sort of thing. I do want to move on back to the Lotus Marketplace incident that you hinted before, Spencer. This is a very interesting uh, turn of events. This happened back in the 1990s, so we're going even further back in time. But I will warn you, viewers, it's okay. It's the last time we'll be going back in time this episode, all right? That's it. We're just going back to 1990. That's it. So I want to read this article here. It's titled The Lessons of the Lotus Marketplace, Implications for Consumer Privacy in the 1990s. This was written in 1991, I believe, by Mary J. Coleman. I'll just read a few lines here. On April 10th, 1990, Lotus Development Corporation proudly announced its plans to release the Lotus Marketplace household. According to the trade press, Marketplace was expected to revolutionize the list industry by making names, addresses, demographic, and prior purchase behavior data for 120 million US consumers available on a CD-ROM. Now, for our younger viewers who don't know what a CD-ROM is, Google it, because I don't know either. But no, this is really interesting to read, and it's very scary, I think, that this kind of project did take off and was organized by a software company as big as Lotus was. Like 120 million US consumers data just there available on a list. That's pretty similar to what we see nowadays, especially with Facebook. Again, we'll talk about that in a later episode, but it's incredible that this kind of scandal or incident existed even back then, and thank goodness it never thank goodness it did get cancelled. I should mention that it got cancelled eventually. I will read about that now. So, two features of the Lotus Marketplace were responsible for mobilizing the opposition, which led to its cancellation: the contents of the database and a desktop technology platform. So, essentially, I'll sum this up by saying, if you were to sign up to this project or to have this product, you would receive all this data as stated, but you as the end user would then own this data, which means you can distribute it in any way you like and use it in whatever you want. So this could lead to things like fraud, which is very, very scary and terrifying. So thank goodness there was, a mobile opposition that actually stood up and said, this isn't okay. And it's amazing they stood up against, not only Lotus Marketplace, but Equifax as well, which
My,
did.
my understanding is it was for its time it was still a very quite large opposition to this. Like there was like a few thousand, I think, I think 30,000 if I'm remembering correctly. Do you remember the amount of people that were opposed to this and actively tried to demonstrate against Equifax and Lotus in this like privacy scandal?
I'm not certain. It must have been thousands of people for, both of these, massive bodies to step down and say, oh, we can't let this go ahead. Oh yeah, it does say here more than 30,000 individuals exercise the option to opt out. So there you have it. I will be leaving a link to this archived article in the description of our YouTube video because it is a really interesting read, and it's just amazing to sort of uncover this archaeology of a digital story, an almost digital disaster that nearly happened. And it's amazing that, people did stand up to say, no, I don't want this. And even all the way back then, people were aware of how their data was being used and did not consent to it being spread. It's very interesting.
That's That's what's most impressive to me, because this was 1990. This is in the very like early days of like people being on the internet. The fact that this was able to spread to so many people and so many people became aware of this issue and actively, like went against what was going on and tried to like for the concern of their own like privacy and for the benefit of their own like personal data, like they were actively involved against this. It's very impressive for me to read about, like for 1990.
Oh yeah, it's yeah, like I'm speechless, honestly. Like it's staggering something like this could ever happen. Like I never would have imagined it really, because back in 1990, this was still when people were, you know, very sort of mistrusted with computer technology, which may have informed the decision for 30,000 people to come forward and, oppose this. But it's, people were still learning how to use a mouse and keyboard. People were still trying to grasp what's on the screen and just what kind of opportunities were in front of them. The ability to save, store, and transfer data in such a way that you could with computer technology, and surf a virtually infinite digital scape that is the internet. Uh, it's incredible that this kind of data incident was even imaginable back then. And let alone that the fact that it actually happened too. It's like it's almost like a foreshadowing with what's going on with Facebook as well. Like you can't write this. You can't write this if you tried. It's incredible. Let's talk about the George Floyd protest. So, for a bit of a quick refresher, I believe George Floyd was murdered by a police officer by the name of Derek Chauvin in March of 2020, I believe it is. The details are a little hazy for me. Um, we're not really going to focus on the actual case itself. A lot of people know exactly what happened. The police officer was, convicted and whatnot. We're going to sort of more focus on the protests and the outcry surrounding the incident. So I might hand it off to Spencer for this.
Yeah, definitely I can see what you're saying about more the protest, not the actual incident. Obviously, the protest being sort of an optimistic look into what digital activism can do when a bunch of people use it for a just cause or to benefit something. Looking back on it now, the George Floyd protests are considered to be like one of the largest in US history. It's an estimated about 15 to 26 million people attended, and there was an average of 140 protests a day in the month that followed George Floyd's death. And considering what was going on at the time with the coronavirus pandemic and all, these numbers are really unprecedented. Because if you think about it, there's a high chance that a lot of people didn't attend because of the restrictions in place and because of their fear of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah.
So the fact that these numbers reach these highs just goes to show how many people did care about this issue and felt so strongly about it. Because it's not as if they just brushed off the pandemic entirely. Like a lot of them were visibly seen wearing masks and stuff. So obviously they did care somewhat about the dangers of the coronavirus pandemic. It's just that they viewed the injustice that had occurred was so strong that they had to do something in spite of these restrictions in place and the coronavirus pandemic occurring at that time. The demand for justice for them took precedent over that. Because what had happened was so fresh and so like horrifying that they just had to do, like, if they sat at home and did nothing, for them that would have been like worse than like.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
You would have almost felt guilt, to not, participate in such an outcry like that. You'd almost feel like you were contributing to, the opposition. And because I've never really understood that sort of perspective until now, there's been this trend, especially with like social media in the last like few years or whatever. You see it on Twitter all the time. People saying things like, if you stay silent, then you're not an ally, you're the opposition. I've never really understood that until I saw the George Floyd protests over in the US. It was pretty eye-opening, and definitely educational. And I don't mean to sort of say that in like a insensitive way. Like obviously what happened to George was horrible, and I do feel for his family and for the African American community, in all nations. It's, yeah, I don't want to focus too much on the incident, but I just want to say, it's definitely horrifying. But it is, it gives me faith in humanity that people will stand up to that kind of injustice. And the way that they did that to sort of not really circumvent, but more sort of dance around the COVID pandemic was really innovative. I don't remember, I don't recall seeing like a lot of fiascos in the media about people getting a great influx of cases in the areas that these protests took place. If anything, those cases, in at least in my opinion, was more of a consequence of how the U.S. government and how U.S. like state officials handled it as well. Because obviously, you know, there's no debate about this. They haven't handled it in the greatest way possible, and I mean, a lot of places haven't handled the pandemic in the greatest way possible.
Yeah.
But that's just how it is. It's not like you don't deal with a pandemic every day. Like this is completely new to everyone, young, old, you and me. It's
Yeah.
we're all under the same umbrella.
Yeah.
And then of course the George Floyd protests, they did actually lead to a lot of consequences and a lot of actual change in the U.S. Spencer,
Exactly.
did you want to talk about that?
Oh yeah, sure. So immediately within 2 weeks, there was a vote by Minneapolis councillors, and if you remember, Derek Chauvin was a member of the Minneapolis Police Department. So this was fresh in the state that the actual crime had been committed in the that Derek Chauvin was eventually convicted for murdering George Floyd. So they voted they voted a veto-proof vote to dismantle and relocate resources from the Minneapolis Police Department to mental health services because they had found that a good number of their calls in the Minneapolis state had been dealing with mental health issues. So they were going
Right.
to relocate resources to supporting these institutions that could better deal with cases of mental health and stuff like that. Which is like really like it's kind of a new idea that you don't think about it because I think more in America, this is my understanding that you call the police like on everything. There's no like mental health channel that you can call when you see someone suffering from mental health or like having like an outburst or something.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a revolutionary idea to me that you'd have like a mental health department that deals with these things. Like yeah, even like in Australia, like I think that's like revolutionary. Like the police shouldn't be called on everything because they're not trained to deal with everything. Mental health professionals are better equipped to deal with that sort of thing.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
yeah. Elsewhere in New York City, Mayor Bill de Blasio had committed to various police reforms, such as reallocating funding towards areas such as youth and health services, which is sort of similar to what Minneapolis had pledged to do with their vote. And they also, Bill de Blasio also committed to repealing Section 50A, which prevented public from accessing disciplinary records of police officers, which, obviously gives more transparency into the people that are supposed to be serving and protecting, the public. Like you can
Right.
have more insight into who they actually are, and all their past actions won't be swept under the rug. Like,
Exactly. Yeah, it's just, it's about time that something did start to change. And I think what happened with George was something that just set off something in a lot of people's heads in the US, regardless of
yeah,
whether, you were for or against, the outcry for, fixing the injustice that's been going on in the police system in the United States.
yeah.
Um, yeah, it's such a complex situation. I've just got everything sort of like rushing back to my mind. Because it's been a while since it's happened. I think it's been about a year and a half since it happened.
Yeah.
It's it's baffling to me. I remember seeing a lot of sort of reports on the protests that were going on. I remember seeing like there was a lot of riots as well. A lot of people burning buildings. I think there was a police precinct that was burnt down in Minneapolis somewhere. Which, if that doesn't show people's like rage to this kind of issue and with what happened, then I don't know what will.
I mean,
Um,
yeah, exactly. It was something that had been happening like before before the George Floyd incident.
yeah,
So many times that I think it just built up in a lot of people, and they finally expressed that anger towards the police departments of their states and their country. and it all just came out into one massive event of rebellion against the crimes of the police department that had occurred.
Yeah, and I'm actually glad you said that because I just remembered a really crucial detail of this entire incident. The only reason we ever knew about what happened to George is because of social media, digital activism.
Yep.
Someone
Yeah.
someone recorded what happened on their mobile phone and put it to social media, and that
Yep.
kind of availability where you can sort of put whatever you want online allowed for people to see exactly what happened because we all know nowadays most police officers have a body cam on them, and the way that most of them work in my mind is when you press record, it records, whatever's going on until you click stop recording. But it also records, the previous 30 seconds of footage that was captured on there, but without audio to sort of give like a precedent to exactly like what the police officer tried to record. If these police officers around George had body cams, I guarantee they would have gotten rid of the footage straight
Yeah.
away, 100%. And I know not every officer there was on the same sort of playing field or the same kind of, they didn't all have the same intentions. Like some of them were telling Chauvin to, stop what he was doing, and he was telling them to back off or whatever. Um, but yeah, it's amazing how one person with a smartphone was able to broadcast this to the world, and people said, this needs to be seen. It's almost like like a hidden rule in social media of what has to be seen and what hasn't. People have almost a divine way of intervening and making something uh, explode in popularity. And I think the sort of rage that I hinted to earlier was part of that. People were so angry at this that they had felt that it was their duty, their right to share this absolutely everywhere they could. What do you think, Spencer? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I was going to come to that actually. Who knows if Derek Chauvin would have even been convicted if someone hadn't been there to record and there hadn't been such a public outcry and backlash towards all this. Because from what I understand, this really became like a spectacle and like a big point of like politics at the time and like what was going on. I think even when he was eventually convicted, a lot of people, 18 million I think was the number, actually listened to that conviction. So a lot of people were clearly concerned with what was going on and clearly actively trying to be engaged in what was going on. So the fact that someone was able to, record this and make it public and make everyone know about that, like that's the amazing aspect that we talk about with digital activism. The fact that so many people could have become involved and something like that could have, potentially have been swept under the rug, because we've seen it happen before where stuff has happened and people have gotten away with it because like they were able to just like bury it under, like with that being such a public spectacle, like everyone was able to like band together and demand this justice, and which obviously eventually led to the George Floyd protest and the massive like rise of people like rallying against the injustices that had occurred as a result of George Floyd.
Yeah, it's amazing how much organization and planning came from a platform where that kind of thing isn't really sort of, it's not built in. It's not like a button you can click on and say, "Oh, let's all do this," It's everyone just agreeing on the same thing and saying, "Okay, let's go and do this." And it's not just
Yeah.
that, it's not just that as well. People had the ability to share things like protest guides and things like that, and tips for being an activist. You had professionals weighing their expertise in and sharing their knowledge, for free with people and saying, "Hey, if you want to, come along and contribute to this, I've got the knowledge. You just, here's a guide for you." But I sort of want to get into sort of cancel culture a little bit. So if you don't know what cancel culture is, it's pretty popular on Twitter. It's the sort of phenomena of people, usually, tweens or teenagers, bringing up old tweets or posts or content from anyone famous, whether it's an online celebrity or just a real celebrity, bringing up, things from their past that might not look very good in today's political climate, and trying to deplatform them in a sense because of what was said back then. Usually, someone says a hateful slur or something, or they have an incredibly bad take on some political topic, and people, of course, get very upset of it, very upset about it. to the point where it's just they create hashtags and they just fill Twitter feeds with just cancel this person, cancel that person. I think like Stephen King tried to get canceled or something, because I think he said something like he didn't consider diversity when he was like writing his stories or whatever, which is an interesting perspective, at the very least. But I don't think it's worth deplatforming him. But that's just my opinion. Cancel culture is one heck of a beast, and it's still being sort of observed and figured out even to this day. And it almost seems like people want to cancel just about anyone for any reason, just for something to do. And like I said, it's usually teenagers, people who are unemployed, people spend a lot of time online. It's just, I can't seem to justify it. It's just, I feel like it's just a bunch of bored teenagers just trying to find a hashtag to spam over and over again. What do you think, Spencer? What do you think cancel culture is?
Well, I mean, I think there's degrees to it. I support cancel culture when it does its job of holding like people in higher power like accountable.
Yeah.
Because often you think of like people in Hollywood or celebrities or something like that as like these untouchable like figures. Like, I think the Me Too movement is a good example of cancel culture done right, because like you see these people like Harvey Weinstein who've gotten away for so long because they're so powerful that they can abuse their power to like keep people out of Hollywood and lie and deceive people. And I think cancel culture is a bunch of people getting together to hold people like that accountable when it's done right. But obviously there's the negative end of it. Like, if someone says something you don't like, and if it's just something harmless, like they disagree with you on a certain like innocent point, like who they're voting for or something, I don't think they deserve to be cancelled for that. But if they're doing something like morally horrible, like what we saw in the Me Too incident, then I think it's good to hold these people accountable.
Yeah, I think in my mind, I personally have like a line between, holding someone accountable and canceling them. Um, I do agree, you should hold people accountable when they do make mistakes. Um, if I think I could still even agree with that for like past mistakes from 10, 20 years ago, because if it's never addressed or apologized for or dealt with or anything, then I do think it needs to be brought up and at least discussed. You can't put everything under a rug. So I guess that's like one, good part of cancel culture. I think one of my issues with it is that because of how passionate people are with that sort of idea, it sort of clogs up social media in a way. Like, you go onto Twitter and it's the only thing you see. It's usually one YouTuber said something that I didn't like 10 years ago. And it's like, oh, well, okay, what's the big deal with that? Boom, 100,000 tweets. And it's like, well, what about the important things, And then again, that brings in the whole argument of, should important things be on Twitter? Is that the reason why you should be using Twitter? What's Twitter for? Is entertainment and, cancel culture blocking these airways?
Yeah, it's almost like what you were saying before. It's almost like it's not people just randomly found something from 10 years ago to cancel. It's like they already have their opinion on this influencer and they want to cancel them, so they go looking for something from 10 years ago. That kind of canceling where it's like you already hate this person, so you just want to find something to vilify them for. That's not the kind of like good. Like it's more about holding people accountable, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think it works better when it does have an observable effect, and when it does hold people accountable and of course instigate change. I think in the grand scheme of things though, slacktivism is a mostly negative thing, and a lot of people look at slacktivism as if it's the only part of digital activism, and that's why there's such a stigma surrounding digital activism. People take one look at all these teenagers posting like this one hashtag, or posting like this one like equals $1 thing on Facebook or whatever, and thinking, that's all there is to digital activism, which, well, is just completely ignorant. And it's like, it's hard to look past that because of how rampant slacktivism is, but there's more to it than that. I think it's just so widespread because of how easy it is to take part in slacktivism, whether intentional or not, because all it takes is to pretend like you care. That's it. All you have to do is post one hashtag, one image, and that's it. And you're part of making digital activism look worse. Congratulations.
I think it's the constant engagement on social media. It's like you see something pop up that you feel a little bit concerned about, like, oh, this thing happened, I could go and protest about it or something, but I'm constantly engaged. I can just keep scrolling and do whatever. It's much easier for me to just like something and move on than it is for me to go outside and start demonstrating, start protesting. I do think minor steps are important. Doing something like signing a petition or like tweeting out your support for something is better than doing nothing. At least you're doing something. But when you're actively substituting that for doing something like effective and actually going out and doing something major, if you're using it as a substitute, from what we've learned in our previous research, digital activism works best when it actually encourages people to go out and do things like we saw with the George Floyd Black Lives Matter stuff. Like it works best when it gets people together to like work towards like a common goal and get out and protest than it does when it substitutes major things with minor things.
Yeah, I'm actually really glad you brought that up. That segues perfectly into my next point. I wanted to talk about Blackout Tuesday. I know we've brought up the whole George Floyd, incident and the Black Lives Matter protests surrounding that incident, quite a bit in this podcast. But I want to bring it up for one final time because I think Blackout Tuesday is a really interesting sort of series of events that should be covered in this episode. So if you don't know, Blackout Tuesday happened on the 2nd of June, 2020. This was about a week after the passing of George Floyd. And essentially what happened was 28 million Instagram users posted a black square on this particular date with the hashtag Blackout Tuesday. The reason they did this, as reported, is to show their support for Black Lives Matter, that that entire movement, and to mourn for George Floyd. And of course, that sounds good on the surface, but that's a recurring pattern in this podcast. It sounds good on the surface, but it isn't really all that good. I think at least one interesting note is that, so many people can get on board with one thing, but this thing is very arbitrary. It's one picture, not even a picture, just a color with a hashtag. And what this ended up doing was, one of the side effects of this entire Blackout Tuesday hashtag is that it actually blocked out important posts on Instagram about, these protests and, police brutality in America. It just completely washed these feeds out of anything, useful. No one could get any actual information about the protests or anything because of Blackout Tuesday. There were so many posts everywhere of people, just continuing with this Blackout Tuesday trend. And it was ridiculous. Like, good on you for supporting Black Lives Matter and everything. But I think so many people were ignorant in what they were doing because you can't really get that much information from one hashtag and one black square. It's I think it's just reductive because, like I said, it did block out a lot of really important posts. Is there any comments you want to make about that, Spencer? Do you remember any of this Blackout Tuesday nonsense when it happened?
Yeah, I remember seeing it a few times. Again, I think minor steps are better than doing nothing. Sure, if you post a black square, you could be doing something more, but if people see the black square thing and they search up what it's about and they learn more about the cause, for people who previously may not have paid much attention to it, I think it's still doing something somewhat valid. Sure, people are going to abuse it. People who don't really care about it, they just want to look good and look morally righteous on social media or whatever. But even then, at least people are becoming more aware from it. That's just how I feel about it.
Yeah. But as you said, it's a lot easier to keep scrolling than it is to actually click on anything and do some research, That's why I think a lot of people, when they looked at this Blackout Tuesday nonsense, they sort of thought, oh, is this what people are doing in the wake of George Floyd's death? That's ridiculous, and then they just make a whole farce of, trying to be digitally active with, an online space. And I think it just sort of dampened the reputation a bit. If you could post something like a black square with that hashtag and actually say something, then all credit to you. But at least with most of the posts that I saw, it was just nothing, and I just thought it was counterproductive to sort of undermine everything that had happened into just a color,
I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's counterproductive because, again, I still feel like doing something minor is still doing something better than nothing. And it's not like the people who posted the Black Square thing, I don't think the majority of them would have done anything real. Like, they wouldn't have gone out and protested. So if that's what they're going to do, at least they've done the bare minimum rather than like doing nothing at all. And with the keep scrolling thing, like, people are just going to keep scrolling no matter what. It doesn't matter what someone would post. Like it's just the nature of social media. We're constantly engaged by everything. Like, we're going to see something and keep scrolling, like, because the majority of people who do that, they're not interested in actively going out and doing something. They just want to, feel engaged from what they're looking at. But, it goes back to the slacktivism thing. Like, people are just, that's just the nature of like the internet, like, and the online space.
And to make a difference, so I think a lot of people did use this to show their support from afar, even if they didn't actually, contribute to a real world change. They at least sort of, contributed to that number of 28 million posts and sort of said, this many people on Instagram, agree with this or, want to be part of this movement. At least they, did that in that regard. I mean, there's so many layers to it. There's a lot of complexity, and I find it amazing how there's so much complexity in people posting a black square on Instagram. It's amazing how much you can read from that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's more part of it's like a part of digital activism where it's like we want to start a trend,
right,
to like try and like achieve more awareness about something. If it led to a couple of more people, like looking into it and researching it and getting involved, then it's done its cause. But yeah, it's the fact that we're talking about it now proves that it did get some sort of like attention, and even if we're talking about it, discussing if it's a positive or a negative thing, if it got our attention and it got the attention of like a lot of people, then I'm sure that it has convinced more than a few people to get involved in the cause.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. It's guaranteed that out of all those 28 million posts, at least one person went and did the research to figure out exactly what everyone was talking about. Because, of course, maybe the entire news of what happened to George Floyd or, the protests that were going on, maybe that wasn't apparent to people outside of the US, because even with how advanced we are with technology nowadays, news can still take a while to travel, especially people try to block out that news and say, oh, this didn't happen, or this person didn't kill that person, There's all sorts of different biases and, sort of allegations and all these different things that can sort of shroud the truth. But that's about it for today's episode. I would like to thank everyone for joining us on YouTube and SoundCloud. I would like to announce that this is the final official episode of our, digital activism saga for this podcast. It's been a really fun journey. We've learnt a lot. We've even learnt a lot in just this episode as well, which is really cool. It's been a really, really interesting journey. It's the first podcast I've ever done. It's been a lot of work, definitely, but it's been a challenge I've enjoyed to embark on. It's been great to work in this kind of space and, talk about digital activism while being digitally active. I think that's the best part about it, honestly. And I think this is a really effective part of our project for Victoria University. Of course, Spencer, it's been an absolute pleasure working with you on this podcast, and I look forward to continuing this project with you, with the paper and the report and everything.
Yeah, I got to say a similar thing. Like, I was very nervous going into the podcast because obviously I'd never done anything like this either. But I've felt rewarded doing this. It's helping me develop skills that I hadn't learned. And after every podcast, I feel like we've improved as hosts, as facilitators of discussion. I've enjoyed some of the discussions we've had, like especially this episode. It's made me see different perspectives and made me, have valuable like sort of talks to make me learn things. And also, it's obviously been amazing working with Ryan. And Ryan is kind of like the genius of this podcast. He's done the YouTube channel. He's done the thumbnails. He's done all the editing. Obviously, I can't do that. Like, I don't have my expertise in that area. And he's really kind of set out the themes of like what we're going to discuss in the episode. And he's kind of led the discussion. So yeah, all the magic goes to him.
Oh, I'm flattered, you doll. But yeah, no, that's about everything. Even though this is the end of the digital activism saga, as I said, we do have something special coming out in about a week. I'm not going to say what it is yet, but I'm very excited to start working on it. and you'll see that in a week. So look forward to that. It's going to be a bit of a send off to this series. And hey, maybe we'll come back one day. Who knows? Maybe we'll find some more stuff to talk about. Maybe the digitally active world will just explode with just things to observe and things to learn about. But yeah, that's about it. That's all I've got to say for today. Thank you everyone for joining us on YouTube and SoundCloud. But yeah, no, that's about everything. Thank you, Spencer, for joining me.
Thank you, Ryan. It's been fun.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. And yeah, I hope everyone takes care. And yeah, hope you enjoyed the series. Bye bye.